My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 31 years old, born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, but for the last decade, I've lived in Boston, where I built my career in corporate law. I've always been meticulous, the kind of woman who color codes her files, irons her blouses the night before, and never, ever walks into a courtroom without having rehearsed every possible counter-argument in her head. My friends call it control, but I know it's more than that. It's survival. For the past 3 years, I thought I had found the one man who could share my life without threatening the structure I'd worked so hard to build. His name was Daniel Whitmore, 35 years old, finance executive, polished to perfection. The kind of man who could walk into a room and bend it around his presence without even trying. We met at a charity gala, where he complimented the fact that I spoke more than 2 languages and seemed more interested in the quiet moments than the showy ones. I thought we understood each other. I thought we were building a foundation for the rest of our lives. The night before the wedding was supposed to be the calm before the storm, champagne toasts with bridesmaids, a few tears over old stories, a final dress fitting. But Daniel was acting distant. He claimed he had late calls with overseas clients. His phone buzzed twice during dinner. He excused himself to check in with the venue staff but took his phone with him. It was subtle, but I've spent years reading people in high-stakes negotiations, and his patterns were off. Later that night, when the house had quieted and my maid of honor was asleep in the guest room, I went to the kitchen for water. Daniel's tux jacket was draped over the chair from our rehearsal dinner, and his phone of all things was in the inside pocket. He never left his phone unattended, ever. The screen lit up as I picked it up. A preview of a message flashed across. Tomorrow can't come fast enough. After the vows, we'll finally have what we want. It wasn't from a woman. It was from a man, Alex. My stomach turned, not from the fact that he was with a man, but from the realization that everything, every smile, every touch, every promise was part of a performance leading to this moment. I didn't just read one message. I scrolled. I read the months-long thread of late-night plans, shared hotels, whispered complaints about me, and finally, the last message that shattered whatever part of me still wanted to deny it. After the wedding, I'll find a way to get rid of her without losing anything in the settlement. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't even wake anyone. I simply placed it back in the jacket, went upstairs, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. Every plan I had for my life had just shifted, and not because I was leaving him, but because I knew exactly how this would end. Not with a scene, not with screaming, with precision. The next morning, my makeup artist commented on how calm I looked. I let her think it was bridal joy. My dress, silk crepe, long sleeves, no embellishments, was my armor. The walk down the aisle felt like a negotiation table. Guests smiled, phones out, flowers swaying in the summer air. Daniel stood at the altar, perfect as ever, his eyes holding that familiar mix of charm and calculation. The officiant began. Daniel reached for my hands. I let him take them, holding his gaze without blinking. When it was my turn to speak my vows, I reached into the bouquet, where I had hidden a folded piece of paper. The whisper of the crowd dimmed as I unfolded it. My voice was steady, low enough to force the room into silence, but loud enough that the microphone carried every word. After the wedding, I'll find a way to get rid of her without losing anything in the settlement. I didn't say his name. I didn't explain. I just folded the paper back up, placed it gently on the altar, and stepped back. Daniel's face drained of color, his mouth parting but no words coming out. The murmur of guests began, sharp intakes of breath, whispers, shifting in seats. His parents stared at him as if they'd never seen him before. I turned, walked down the aisle alone, the click of my heels echoing in the silence. No one stopped me. No one called after me. My veil trailed behind me like a closing curtain. By the time I reached the courtyard, I knew exactly what the next steps would be. The wedding wasn't canceled. It had simply transformed into Act 1 of something much bigger. He thought I'd vanish in humiliation, but humiliation is loud and clumsy. What I had in mind was quiet, sharp, surgical, and it began the moment I closed the door of the black town car waiting for me outside the church. The moment I stepped out of the church, still in my wedding dress, with the heavy silence of my own choosing wrapped around me, I knew I couldn't simply leave him. Leaving would be too easy to explain away. I needed to vanish in a way that forced him to stand alone in the wreckage he had created, stripped of my presence, my silence, and the safety net I had once been. The car that picked me up wasn't a limousine but a black sedan I had booked 2 days earlier under a pseudonym before I even knew the full truth, before I read that final, venom-laced message he sent to his lover. Maybe a part of me had already been bracing for an exit. As the driver pulled away from the church, I watched the crowd spill onto the steps, their heads turning in confusion, their mouths forming questions they'd never dare ask me to my face. I didn't wave. I didn't look back twice. I had no destination in the traditional sense. My bag's 2 small leather suitcases were already in the trunk, packed the night before when my instincts began whispering that I would not be sleeping in the same house after the ceremony. I told the driver to head north, toward the quiet towns along the coast, where high-priced inns and discreet staff knew the value of privacy. I checked into a place where the ocean's roar drowned out any lingering doubts in my mind. From that room overlooking gray waves, I began the first phase of my vanishing act. The first rule was no direct contact, no calls, no texts, no explanations to him, his family, or our friends. I let the unanswered questions ferment. He would have to face his parents' stares, his friends' whispers, the judgment of everyone in attendance. My absence would speak louder than any confrontation could, and while he scrambled to control the narrative, I quietly erased myself from his daily life. I disabled location sharing on every app, logged out of all shared accounts, and set my phone to a new number within hours of leaving. The wedding planner, still chasing final payments, received a polite but vague email from me. Please address all future communication to the groom. My dress, still pristine, was picked up by a courier I'd arranged in advance and sent to a designer friend in New York, who would keep it until I decided whether to sell it, donate it, or burn it. Social media became my silent stage. I didn't delete my profiles. I froze them. No updates, no photos, no cryptic quotes. The absence of my voice made people talk more than any statement ever could. They filled in the blanks with their own theories, and I knew every rumor would reach him eventually. I wanted him trapped in that mental maze, wondering which version of the story I might confirm or expose if I chose to return. Meanwhile, I started planting the seeds for the next moves. The prenup, the joint accounts, the investments, all the little pieces he thought were harmless formalities were about to become weapons. But that part of the plan would come later. For now, my focus was on making my absence unbearable for him. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that the day after I left, he tried to call me 17 times. By day 3, he'd sent a string of emails, half furious, half pleading. He wanted an explanation, or maybe just the chance to manipulate me back into silence. He got neither. I left every message unopened, marking them only as read to let him know I had seen them and chosen not to respond. The weight of that choice was deliberate. Silence, after all, is not emptiness, it's control. His family began calling too. At first, the tone was concerned, almost tender. We're worried about you, dear. But when it became clear that I wasn't coming back or offering them any reassurance, the concern shifted into subtle accusations. You made quite the scene. Do you realize how that looked? I ignored them as well. Let them stew in the embarrassment of not knowing. Let the unanswered questions become their dinner conversation for weeks. What I didn't tell them was that I was already collecting my own arsenal of answers: bank statements, message screenshots, financial authorizations, all from a safe, secure place far outside his reach. Each piece would fit into the larger strategy I was quietly constructing. But until that strategy was ready to unfold, I wanted him alone in the spotlight, performing damage control for an audience that was starting to suspect the man in the tuxedo had far more to hide than the bride who walked away. By the end of the first week, the story had leaked to the press. Not the full truth, not yet, but just enough for the gossip columns to label it the altar walkout. He tried to paint himself as the victim of a cold feet bride, but anyone who'd seen my face at the altar knew better. Silence is hard to misinterpret when it comes laced with finality. And so, I stayed gone. No public appearances, no slip-ups, no accidental sightings in familiar places. The more I kept to the shadows, the more people leaned in to listen for me. He could not chase me without exposing himself further. And while he twisted in that uncomfortable limelight, I was already preparing the next move, a financial strike that would hit harder than any public humiliation. When I left that church, I took more than my dignity. I took the certainty that every step away from him was a step toward a kind of power he would never see coming. And he wouldn't even realize how much I'd already taken until I made my presence felt again quietly, surgically, and exactly where it would hurt most. By the time the second week rolled around, my absence had transformed from a scandal into a logistical nightmare for him. He was desperate to move forward with whatever fantasy he had been building with his lover, but there was a detail he hadn't considered. In our carefully constructed life, I was the quiet architect. My signature, my knowledge, and my access were woven into every layer of his plans he now had to execute without me. That was where the next phase began. The financial entanglement between us wasn't just accidental, it had been deliberate on my part. Years earlier, when we'd combined certain accounts and signed our prenup, I'd made sure to have my name and my oversight attached to every significant transaction. He had thought it was about trust and transparency. I knew better. Relationships are full of blind spots, and his would one day be my escape route. I started with the joint account. It was the one he'd been using to fund the honeymoon, an extravagant trip I now knew he intended to share not with me, but with his lover. The airline tickets, the luxury resort bookings, the private car services, all paid for with a card that had my name embossed on it right beside his. A quick call to the bank, armed with the right account numbers and security codes, and the funds were locked pending an internal review. I didn't drain them outright, that would have tipped my hand too soon. No, I wanted him to discover, at the airport or at the resort check-in desk, that the card didn't work. I wanted to create friction, not closure. Next was the investment account. The prenup had clauses that kept most of my assets separate, but he had convinced me to contribute to a joint growth portfolio that, in his words, would secure our future. I logged in, removed my authorization for new withdrawals, and set alerts so that any activity would require my approval. The irony was delicious. He had always brushed off my attention to the fine print as paranoia, yet now that paranoia was his prison. Then came the subtle strike, one he wouldn't notice right away. He had a business expense card linked to a secondary account I'd once helped him open for tax efficiency. I didn't close it. I just replaced the primary cardholder with myself, citing suspected fraudulent activity as the reason for the change. The replacement card was shipped to a P.O. box registered under my name in a different state. I knew he'd eventually call the bank and demand answers, but by then, the delay would already have cost him deals, bookings, and goodwill. While I worked on the accounts, I also revisited the prenup with fresh eyes. Buried deep in the legal jargon was a clause about material misrepresentation, a polite way of saying that if one party entered the agreement under false pretenses, particularly about their intentions for the marriage, certain protections could be revoked. It wasn't enough to make a legal move just yet, but it was a seed worth watering. In time, it would grow into something far more devastating than a frozen card. Through all of this, I kept my digital footprint minimal. I used secure connections, burner devices, and encrypted messaging to communicate with the financial institutions. Every move I made left no trail that could lead him back to me, not unless I wanted it to. I heard from a mutual acquaintance, the kind who doesn't realize they're a source, that he had shown up at the airport with a suitcase and a smug grin, expecting to disappear into some sun-soaked fantasy. The grin didn't last. His card was declined at the airline counter, then again at the luxury hotel he had booked. He argued, red-faced and sweating, while other guests stared. By the time he checked his email and saw the account review notice, his lover was already on the phone, demanding to know why their trip was falling apart. That image, him cornered, fumbling for excuses, was almost satisfying enough. Almost. But my goal wasn't just to ruin his plans. It was to leave him feeling the kind of instability and vulnerability he had tried to engineer for me. The loss of control. The slow panic of realizing that the ground you stand on belongs to someone else. And he hadn't even begun to feel the weight of what was coming. The frozen accounts were just the beginning. They were the first small fracture in the foundation of his life. The real collapse would come when I turned my attention to the people who still believed in him, the ones whose respect and trust he relied on to hold his public image together. Before that, though, I let him stew. Financial strain has a way of infecting everything it touches: relationships, reputations, confidence. I wanted those cracks to deepen before I widened them. I wanted him tired, defensive, and off balance when the next hit came. The silence was still my greatest weapon. I didn't gloat, didn't send a single "hope you're enjoying the trip" message. I let the unanswered questions eat at him in the dark, the same way his betrayal had gnawed at me in the hours before I walked to the altar. What he didn't know was that my next move would shift the battlefield entirely. Money was one thing, but family was another. And the same way I had dismantled his access to our shared finances, I was about to dismantle the safe, comfortable relationships that had protected him from the truth. The accounts were frozen. The money was untouchable. The damage had begun. And in the quiet of my coastal hideaway, I was already preparing for the family turn. If money was the bloodstream of his new life, family was the skeleton that kept his public image standing. His parents, his older sister, and a tightly knit network of cousins, uncles, and godparents had always been his safety net. No matter how reckless he was behind closed doors, they saw him as the golden boy, charismatic, ambitious, the one who could do no wrong. I knew that image was a carefully polished lie, and I knew exactly how to tarnish it without raising my voice. I started with his mother. She had always treated me like a beloved daughter, though in recent months I'd noticed a certain distance, little pauses before she called me by name, subtle changes in her tone. Perhaps he'd already begun preparing her for my absence from his life, spinning some half-truth about why the wedding fell apart. I wasn't about to let him control the narrative. I sent her a simple, formal invitation, dinner, just the two of us, at a quiet, upscale restaurant where privacy was guaranteed. No context, no explanation, just a polite request. The night of the dinner, I arrived early and chose a table in the corner, where dim lighting and heavy drapes kept our conversation out of sight. She arrived looking curious, maybe even hopeful, as if I might offer closure. And in a way, I did. I ordered wine, let the small talk stretch just long enough to lower her guard, and then slid my phone across the table. On the screen were screenshots, the full, unedited conversation between him and his lover from the night before the wedding. I didn't embellish. I didn't add commentary. I just let her read. At first, she scanned quickly, her eyes narrowing at certain words. Then her lips parted, and she slowed down, reading every line. The final message after the wedding, "I'll find a way to get rid of her," made her sit back in silence. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the phone, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But she didn't. She was too proud for that. She simply handed the phone back and said, in a voice lower than I'd ever heard from her, "I need to think." That was enough. The seed was planted. From there, I extended my reach. His father, a man obsessed with the family's reputation in business circles, received an anonymous envelope at his office. Inside, copies of travel itineraries booked on our joint account, reservations for 2 in luxury resorts, all dated after the wedding, none of them with my name on the guest list. Alongside them, a printed copy of a message in which his son joked about playing straight long enough to cash in. No return address, no signature, just proof. His sister came next. She was loyal to him to a fault, the type to defend him in any fight, public or private. So I went for something undeniable, a series of candid photos I'd quietly taken months earlier when he didn't realize I was watching. Photos of him in the very apartment I later reclaimed, with the lover whose name had become the bitter core of all of this. They weren't salacious, but they were intimate enough to shatter her illusions. I didn't send them directly. I accidentally left them on a USB drive in a gift bag she'd forgotten at my apartment, along with a note that read simply, "You should know who you're defending." The reactions came in ripples, and I made sure never to be present when the waves crashed. Whispers started in their circles. A cousin called me brave in a vague social media post. An aunt I barely knew sent me a private message that said, "I always knew something was off about him." His mother stopped posting family photos. His father canceled his appearance at a local gala. The fortress around him wasn't collapsing yet, but the cracks were visible from the outside. Meanwhile, I stayed silent. I didn't respond to the couple of strained texts he sent, the kind that mixed Fox concern with veiled threats. "Why are you involving my family? You need to stop this before it goes too far." I ignored them. The truth was, I wasn't involving his family. I was simply giving them the facts he had worked so hard to hide. Whether they chose to believe him or me was no longer my problem, but I knew him well enough to predict what came next. Isolated from his family's blind loyalty, he would turn to his career for validation. He would double down on work, lean on his professional contacts to keep himself afloat. And that was precisely where I intended to strike next. The family turn wasn't about revenge in its loudest form. It was about the quiet shattering of a man's pillars, one by one, until he had nothing left to lean on. They would still answer his calls, still see him at holiday gatherings, but the warmth would be gone. The doubt would always be there, flickering in their eyes when they looked at him. By the time the family circle had been seated with suspicion and disappointment, I was already moving into position for the next phase, the one that would hit him where he lived, where he boasted, where he believed he was untouchable, his work. And so, with precision, I began crafting the foundation for the work sabotage. By the time I moved to the next stage, the air around him was already thin. Family dinners no longer offered him unconditional validation, and the subtle shift in their tone, the half smiles, the quiet questions must have been gnawing at him. I could picture it perfectly, him sitting in his sleek office, staring out over the city, convincing himself that at least here, in the professional arena, he was still king. That was the illusion I intended to shatter. I knew his work life intimately. We had built parts of it together, late nights drafting proposals, networking at black tie events, the kind of power couple performance that always paid off in client contracts and new partnerships. I had watched him cultivate his reputation like a delicate garden, confident, innovative, trustworthy. It was his currency, and he spent it lavishly. What most people didn't know was that underneath the polish, there were fractures, shortcuts he had taken, lies he had told to land deals, things he had confided to me when he thought we were a team forever. And I had the receipts. Not just the messages to his lover, though those were valuable, but also the borderline unethical emails he'd sent to sway negotiations, the drafts of contracts with clauses designed to trap clients in lopsided terms, and the screenshots of him mocking certain high-profile customers in private chats. I knew exactly which ones to use, and more importantly, I knew exactly where to send them. The first strike was surgical. An anonymous email to one of his biggest clients, attaching the transcript of a conversation where he ridiculed their company's branding and called their CEO a walking bank account with bad taste. I didn't need to write an explanation, the words spoke for themselves. Within days, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that the client had canceled their upcoming renewal and was reevaluating their relationship with his firm. The second was broader, but just as devastating. I created a burner account and sent a packet of compiled concerns to his partners, a curated blend of incriminating emails and financial irregularities, enough to make them question whether he was a liability. I didn't fabricate anything. The truth was potent enough. The beauty of this approach was that I knew how paranoia worked in a business setting. It wasn't about proving guilt, it was about introducing the possibility of it. Once suspicion entered the boardroom, it rarely left. He tried to get ahead of it, I'm sure. Maybe he called his partners, maybe he spun some story about a vengeful ex. But the corporate world doesn't run on personal loyalty. It runs on profit and stability. And he had just become a risk. One partner quietly removed his name from an upcoming project pitch. Another began handling client meetings without him. He wouldn't have noticed it all at once. It would have been a slow erosion, the kind that leaves you wondering if you're imagining it, until one day you realize you're standing alone. The third strike was the most personal. There was an industry award ceremony coming up, a black tie gala where he'd been slated to give a speech. I sent a neatly packaged dossier to the events committee, detailing ethical concerns about one of their honorees. I never named myself as the source. They didn't rescind his invitation, but they quietly reassigned the speech to someone else and moved his seat to a less visible table. When the night came, he still attended, dressed to perfection, but the cameras barely caught him. In an industry where visibility was half the game, this was a public downgrade he couldn't ignore. And then came the whisper campaign, my favorite part. It didn't require me to lift a finger beyond the initial nudge. A carefully placed, I heard, in the ear of the right PR contact. A subtle comment to a journalist friend about how surprising it is when personal scandals bleed into business. I knew exactly which rumors would take root, not the salacious details of his affair, but the suggestion that he couldn't be trusted in negotiations. That kind of reputation damage sticks longer than any gossip about private life. The best part was that I never made it obvious. There were no explosive headlines, no direct accusations with my name attached. Just a series of small, undeniable cuts to his professional image, each one drawing a little more blood. He couldn't rage at me publicly without revealing his own vulnerabilities, and I knew his pride wouldn't let him admit the full extent of his problems. From the outside, it might have looked like bad luck, a client lost here, an opportunity missed there, some award season politics. But I could see the cumulative weight. The man who had once strutted into rooms with his chest out was now carrying tension in his shoulders, his smile just a little too forced. I imagined him checking his phone every few minutes, waiting for some confirmation that he was still relevant, still respected. I wasn't done though. If dismantling his professional standing was satisfying, it was only one pillar of his identity. The next step was to reach into the place he thought was his sanctuary, now the one relationship he believed was safe, the affair that had cost me my wedding. The lover. And it was time to show the lover exactly who and what he was really dealing with. That's where the lover's exposure would begin. By the time I turned my attention to him, the other man, the damage to my ex-fiance's career was already a slow-moving collapse. But I knew there was one thread still keeping him upright, one place he was retreating to for validation, comfort, and the illusion of control, the arms of his lover. I could almost picture them together, my ex playing the victim, spinning tales about the vindictive bride who humiliated him, the lover offering sympathy laced with the smug satisfaction of having won. What neither of them knew was that their little bubble of intimacy was built on a foundation as unstable as sand. And I was about to pull the tide in. I'd read every word of their conversations the night before the wedding, the playful teasing, the not-so-playful contempt for me, the fantasies of a life together free from the dead weight of a wife. But there was something else buried in those exchanges. In between the declarations of desire and the petty gossip, my ex had made comments that hinted at an exit strategy from that relationship too. He'd joked about the lover's expensive tastes and high-maintenance drama, about how he wouldn't put up with it forever, and in one particularly telling message, he had written, "Once I've gotten what I need, we'll see if he's still worth the trouble." That was my leverage. I knew enough about the lover to trace his social circles. He moved in a world that thrived on appearances, private dinners with influential friends, charity events where being photographed mattered as much as the cause itself, late-night gatherings where secrets traded faster than the wine flowed. In that kind of environment, whispers could kill faster than truth, and I was ready to deliver both. The first move was subtle. I sent a neatly arranged folder, screenshots, message excerpts, timestamps to a mutual acquaintance of theirs. I made it look as if someone within their inner circle had grown concerned, framing it as a heads-up for the lover's sake. The screenshots included not just the cold, transactional comments my ex had made about him, but also his bragging about how easy it had been to keep the affair secret, how I wouldn't be a problem for long. I knew exactly how those words would feel to read in private. A betrayal wrapped in arrogance. But I didn't stop there. The second strike was more public, though still cloaked in anonymity. I slipped a few carefully cropped images showing only their initials and dates to a gossip blogger known for fishing stories out of elite social groups. The post was vague enough to avoid legal trouble, but specific enough that anyone who knew them could connect the dots. Prominent businessman's romance may not be as perfect as it seems. Sources hint he's juggling love and ambition with a ruthless edge. It didn't name names, but it lit a fuse in the circles that mattered. I also made sure to plant the idea, through another source, that my ex was only with the lover for strategic gain, contacts, introductions, and financial padding. And the genius of it was, I didn't even have to embellish much. The messages spoke plainly enough. The lover wasn't just being cheated on emotionally, he was being used. The cracks began to show faster than I expected. Within weeks, I heard whispers that the two of them had been seen arguing outside a high-end restaurant, the kind of place where voices are never supposed to be raised. At another event, the lover showed up alone, wearing a smile too tight and leaving early without explanation. Those who noticed didn't need a reason spelled out for them in high society. Absence and body language say more than words ever could. But I wanted one more blow, something undeniable. I timed it perfectly, waiting for a charity gala where they were both scheduled to appear. That morning, the lover received an unmarked envelope at his apartment. Inside, a printed transcript of the most damning conversation I had found, complete with the message, "After the wedding, I'll get rid of her. And eventually, him too." No signature, no explanation. Just the truth, stripped of any cushioning. He didn't show up at the gala. My ex did, alone. And although he tried to glide through the evening as if nothing were wrong, I could tell from the photos that circulated later the stiffness in his posture, the darting glances, the way his smile never reached his eyes that the absence had been noticed. Whispers followed him from table to table. He wasn't just the man whose bride had walked out on him at the altar anymore. He was the man who couldn't keep even his illicit relationship intact. The beauty of this phase wasn't just in the personal damage. It was in the isolation it created. Without the lover propping him up emotionally, he was left to stew in the ruins I'd been quietly engineering for months. No sympathetic ear to listen to his self-pity, no warm bed to retreat to when the professional losses became too sharp to ignore. Just empty rooms and the sound of his own unraveling reputation. And while he tried to patch up the damage, to salvage the fragments of his life, I was already moving to the next stage, one that would strip away not just his relationships, but the physical spaces and assets he thought he still owned. That was where the asset reversal would come into play. By the time I reached this stage, I had stripped away most of his safety nets, the public image, the lover who shielded him from loneliness, the sympathetic narrative he tried to craft after the altar. But there was one thing he still clung to. One illusion of stability that gave him the confidence to believe he could recover his assets. The man had always been arrogant about his possessions. Apartments in the city, a cabin in the mountains, a leased sports car he pretended to own, investments scattered across accounts he thought were untraceable. But the crown jewel, the one that mattered most, was a sleek apartment in one of the most exclusive parts of the city. It wasn't just where he lived now. It was where he had brought the lover, where they had hosted quiet dinners for people who never asked questions, where he'd made the kinds of whispered promises that had once fooled me. To him, that apartment was both a sanctuary and a statement, and he believed beyond doubt that it was untouchable. He'd forgotten about the prenup. When we drafted it years ago, he'd pushed for clauses that would protect his existing assets from any claim I might make. But like so many men who mistake cunning for intelligence, he had overlooked the finer points buried in the legal language. The apartment had been purchased under his company's name after our engagement, a shell corporation he controlled, but one that technically fell under joint marital acquisition once the paperwork was filed. And thanks to the fact that our wedding never happened, that acquisition now existed in a legal limbo that the prenup's default ownership clause handed directly to me. All I had to do was enforce it. I started with my lawyer, a woman who had once told me she didn't believe in vengeance, only in leverage, and who had been watching my quiet campaign with something between professional admiration and personal delight. I slid the paperwork across her desk, highlighting the purchase date and the clause that effectively made the apartment mine. She didn't even smile, she just picked up the phone and began the process. We moved fast. Within a week, I had a court order transferring control of the property. And because my ex had been too arrogant to check the mail from the building's management, the first he heard of it was when a security guard informed him that his keycard no longer worked. I like to imagine the moment he stood there in the marble lobby, designer suitcase at his feet, realizing that his name was no longer on the lease, no longer on the records, no longer on the doorbell. But I wasn't cruel enough to leave him wondering. I sent him a single text, a photo of the apartment's skyline view, the same one he had once shown me as proof that we'd made it, with the caption, "You left more behind than you thought." The ripple effect was immediate. That apartment wasn't just his home. It was where he had kept certain private files, financial documents, copies of contracts that, in the wrong hands, could raise questions about how he managed both his business and his taxes. I didn't have to use them. The knowledge that I could was enough to keep him scrambling, moving assets, making desperate calls to lawyers who couldn't entangle what was already signed and sealed. And the apartment wasn't the only thing. The prenup clause opened doors to other assets acquired in that same gray window between engagement and the wedding date. A lakeside property in Vermont, a small art collection purchased at investment auctions, even a watch collection that he'd started flaunting on social media, pieces that, legally, now belonged to me. I didn't sell them immediately. That would have been too neat to fast. Instead, I had the items appraised, insured, and quietly moved into storage. I wanted him to know they were gone, but not where. I wanted him to picture them locked away somewhere he'd never reach, each one a reminder of the life he thought he was building for himself and his lover, now reduced to a list of losses he could never reclaim. What made this step so satisfying wasn't just the financial damage. It was the symbolic weight. Every key, every deed, every certificate that passed into my hands was another thread pulled from the tapestry of control he'd woven around himself. He had measured his worth in square footage and brand names. Now he was watching, helpless, as those measurements dwindled to nothing. And yet, even then, I wasn't done. Because I knew that taking the apartment, the properties, the tangible proof of his success, would push him toward a kind of desperation that made people sloppy. And when people get sloppy, they make mistakes I could turn into the next move. Which brought me to the part I'd been planning since the day I walked out of that church in silence, taking our story, and making sure the world knew it without me ever having to say his name. That was the beginning of the public statement. By the time I reached this stage, I had stripped him of most of the illusions he clung to: the lover, the money, the apartment, even the sense that he could still control the narrative of what had happened at the altar. But I knew that to finish unraveling the carefully curated image he had built for years, I had to do something that reached beyond him, something that would plant our story in the minds of people who mattered without me ever having to say his name. That's when I decided to write. I didn't want a messy social media rant or some anonymous gossip leak that could be dismissed as petty revenge. I wanted precision. I wanted elegance. I wanted the kind of exposure that couldn't be scrubbed away, that would hang in the air like perfume, subtle at first, but lingering long after the first impression. And so I reached out to a friend who worked as an editor for one of the most prestigious lifestyle magazines in the country. We hadn't spoken in years, but when I sent her a brief note with the subject line, "A wedding that never happened and why," she replied in under 5 minutes. We met at a quiet cafe in the Upper East Side. I came prepared not with names, but with details that would make anyone familiar with him connect the dots without me having to spell it out. I told her about the discovery the night before the wedding, the message that made my skin turn cold, the walk to the altar with my heart pounding not from love, but from restraint. I described the silence in the room when I read those words aloud, and how I had left without a single tear or shout, just a final look at the man who thought he could play to lives against each other. She listened, scribbling notes in the margins of her planner, occasionally looking up at me with that mixture of disbelief and fascination that journalists get when they know they've stumbled upon something raw and rare. But I made one thing clear: the piece could not name him, could not name the lover, could not even use enough specifics to make it legally actionable. What it would do instead was tell a story so vivid, so cutting, that anyone in our social circles and anyone in his business network would recognize him instantly, and everyone else would still feel the sting of it, because betrayal is universal. When the article was published, the headline was simple, almost poetic: "The vows I never spoke." It opened with an image of me standing at the altar, not in hysterics, but holding a small folded piece of paper, the one with his final message written in my handwriting. It spoke about dignity in the face of humiliation, about choosing not to scream but to stand still and let the truth do the work. It wove in observations about secrecy, about the kind of arrogance that makes someone believe they can live 2 lives without consequence, and about the quiet strength it takes to walk away when every instinct screams to destroy the other person then and there. The beauty of the piece was in its restraint. It didn't need to be sensational. It was sharp enough without embellishment. Readers praised it for its honesty, its calm power, its refusal to descend into bitterness. But in the private circles where his name carried weight, it was a detonation. People whispered at dinners, over drinks, in boardrooms. "Did you read that article? You know who she's talking about, right?" It became a kind of litmus test for morality. Those who sided with me became allies. Those who dismissed it as just gossip revealed themselves as people who would have defended him no matter what. And he knew. Oh, he knew. The first time he saw me after the article's release was at a mutual friend's gallery opening. He didn't approach, but I caught the flicker in his eyes, that mix of fury and fear when someone realizes they can't confront you without drawing more attention to their guilt. He couldn't accuse me of defamation, couldn't demand a retraction, couldn't even bring himself to speak to me. All he could do was stand there, drowning in the knowledge that people were looking at him differently now. The article went on to be reprinted in several other publications, shared on social media by writers and relationship coaches who dissected it as an example of radical self-respect. I did interviews, always careful, always measured, where I spoke about the importance of trusting your instincts, of not ignoring the warning signs when someone's story doesn't quite add up. Each time, I kept my tone calm, almost gentle, like this was less a tale of vengeance and more a cautionary fable. But under that calm surface, I knew I was turning the screws tighter. Because for him, this wasn't just about public image, it was about business. His clients were the kind who valued stability, discretion, integrity. Seeing his name whispered in connection with a high society scandal, even without proof, made some of them quietly step back. Deals that had seemed certain began to stall. Invitations to exclusive events stopped arriving. And the worst part for him was knowing he couldn't point to a single overt act on my part to blame just a story that existed in the world now, untouchable, unstoppable. But the public statement wasn't just about him. It was about reclaiming my voice. For months after the altar, people had asked in hushed tones what had happened, why I'd walked away, whether I'd had a breakdown. This article turned that whisper campaign into a clear, unshakable narrative, one that I controlled entirely. It made me untouchable, not just in society, but in the next step I was about to take. Because while the piece was making its rounds and his world was getting smaller, I was preparing the move that would hit him where it hurt most, not just in reputation or possessions, but in the cold, lettered language of the law. That was when I set my sights on the legal strike. By the time I reached this stage, my moves had been deliberate, methodical, and devastatingly quiet. Every step had been designed not just to wound him, but to leave him standing in the wreckage with no idea how to rebuild. But there's a difference between social ruin and legal ruin, and I wanted both. The first takes away the audience. The second takes away the stage. I'd been patient. From the moment I read that message at the altar after the wedding, I'll find a way to get rid of her, I understood that my best weapon wasn't rage, but paperwork. While he stumbled through gossip storms, lost business contacts, and the whispered pity of high society, I'd been compiling a case so airtight it would feel like the walls closing in. I wasn't after an apology. I wasn't after reconciliation. I was after the kind of legal consequence that would follow him long after people stopped talking about the scandal. The key was the prenuptial agreement. Ironically, he had insisted on it, convinced it would protect him. He wanted it to secure certain assets, to define what would happen if we ever divorced. But in his arrogance, he hadn't considered what would happen if the marriage never happened at all. I'd had my lawyer look at it in microscopic detail. Buried in the language was a clause regarding fraud and misrepresentation. If it could be proven that he had entered into the engagement under false pretenses, financial manipulation, concealment of significant relationships, or intent to exploit, the agreement could be voided and damages sought. And I had proof. Every message between him and his lover, every bank transaction, every whispered promise he'd made to them about how once I have access to her accounts, we can finally, all neatly printed, dated, and stored in both digital and physical formats. I'd even obtained copies of correspondence between him and a third party where he openly discussed using the wedding as a cover to secure a line of credit through my connections. That wasn't just betrayal. That was calculated fraud. My attorney and I drafted the complaint with surgical precision. We alleged fraudulent inducement, emotional distress, and financial damages. We included exhibits, not every message, not every piece of evidence that would come later, just enough to make it clear that we weren't bluffing. And then we filed publicly. He got served on a Tuesday morning. From what I later heard, he was in the middle of a meeting with one of the few clients who hadn't yet abandoned him. The process server walked in, confirmed his name, and handed over the thick envelope. There was no way to play it off as nothing. Everyone in the room knew exactly what those papers meant. And because the filing was a matter of public record, it didn't take long for the legal gossip blogs and business news outlets to pick it up. The headline alone, "Bride who walked out at the altar files fraud suit against former fiancé," was enough to make him a pariah in any room where trust was currency. The beauty of the legal strike wasn't just in the filing. It was in the timing. By now, he was already weakened. His income streams were disrupted, his reputation tarnished, his allies reduced to a few self-interested opportunists waiting to see if he'd recover. The lawsuit meant that every penny he had left would now be scrutinized. His attorneys, far more expensive than mine, would bill him for every phone call, every motion, every sleepless night they spent trying to find a defense that didn't exist. He tried to fight it at first, of course. His lawyers filed motions to dismiss, claiming the suit was frivolous, that it was just a bitter ex-fiancé seeking revenge. But every time they opened their mouths in court, my attorney would calmly lay another document on the judge's desk, another email, another text, another piece of correspondence that chipped away at the idea that he was anything other than a con artist in a tuxedo. The real breaking point came during discovery. We requested access to his financial records, and when they arrived, they confirmed everything I'd suspected: payments to his lover's accounts, withdrawals from shared funds without my knowledge, even a draft of a breakup agreement he'd been preparing for after the honeymoon. The arrogance was breathtaking. Privately, I knew what this meant. He couldn't afford to take this to trial. A trial would mean public testimony, witnesses, media coverage that would turn the whispers into full-blown headlines. His best option, the only option, was to settle. And that's exactly what he did. The terms of the settlement are confidential, but let's just say I ensured it wasn't just about the money. There were conditions, things that would restrict his financial movements for years, clauses that would make any future business partner think twice before trusting him. He could keep pretending he was rebuilding, but every step forward would be under the shadow of the deal he'd been forced to sign. When the settlement papers were finalized, I didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no dramatic tearing up of photographs, just a quiet satisfaction, like closing a door that should never have been opened in the first place. I didn't need to shout about my victory. The paperwork spoke louder than I ever could. And yet, there was one final move left, one last act, not in a courtroom, not in a magazine, but in the most public arena of all. It wouldn't involve accusations or legal terms. It would just be me, standing in the same kind of room where I used to see him shine, showing that I had rebuilt not in spite of him, but because I had walked away. That moment would come soon enough. The final stage was waiting. By the time the night of the gala arrived, it had been nearly a year since I walked out of that church. A year since I left him frozen under the weight of his own words, since the whispers began and the dominoes fell exactly in the order I'd lined them up. The lawsuit was behind me now, the settlement sealed, the clauses in place like invisible handcuffs around his future. The financial, social, and personal wreckage I'd orchestrated had settled into permanence. But there was one thing left, not revenge in the legal sense, not even in the financial sense, but something far more symbolic. The annual winter benefit was the kind of event where reputations were made and destroyed without anyone raising their voice. Held in the grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel, it was an evening of black tie elegance, six-figure donations, and the subtle kind of networking that could elevate or erase you from the city's inner circles. He used to live for this kind of night: the sharp tuxedo, the perfect smile, the casual way he'd place a hand on my back and introduce me as the woman who makes me look good. That line had always made me smile politely, even back then. Though now I understood it for what it was: a mask, nothing more. When I stepped out of the car that evening, the February air was crisp enough to sting my cheeks, but the cameras at the entrance were already warming up. I'd chosen my dress carefully, floor-length black velvet with a plunging neckline, the kind of cut that was understated from afar but devastating up close. The diamond bracelet on my wrist wasn't ostentatious, but it caught the light with every movement. More importantly, I wasn't alone. My date, Daniel Mercer, wasn't just handsome, he was untouchable. CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech company, impeccably dressed, and with a reputation for both brilliance and discretion. He was the kind of man who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, which made him all the more dangerous in rooms like this. The moment we walked in, the whispers began. I could feel the shift in the air, not the shocked murmurs of a year ago, but something sharper, more curious. People remembered the scandal. They remembered the altar, the headline, the lawsuit. And now, here I was, not hiding, not diminished, but standing taller than I ever had, with a man whose very presence in my orbit signaled that I had leveled up, not down. It didn't take long for me to spot him. He was across the room, by the bar, talking to a man I recognized as a mid-level investor who wouldn't have dared approach him 2 years ago. His tuxedo was still tailored, but not new. I knew enough about fabric and cut to recognize last season's work. His hair was still styled, but a little too stiff, the kind of careful grooming that tries too hard to hide the strain underneath. He saw me before I saw him, and I watched his face freeze for just a second, just long enough to confirm what I already knew. I was the last person he expected to see here, especially like this. I didn't walk over immediately. That would have been too obvious, too eager. Instead, Daniel and I moved through the crowd with unhurried grace, stopping to speak with people who mattered, laughing at stories, accepting compliments. I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. The more I didn't acknowledge him, the smaller he seemed to become in the room. That was the point. Eventually, the crowd thinned near the silent auction tables, and that's where our paths crossed entirely by accident. "Good evening," I said, my tone warm but distant, as though I was greeting an old coworker I hadn't thought about in years. He tried to muster that old charm, but it faltered. "You look well." "I am well," I replied simply, letting the silence do the rest. Daniel, ever the perfect co-conspirator, placed a hand lightly at my back, a silent but unmistakable gesture of possession. The conversation that followed was brief, polite on the surface, but dripping with subtext. I asked how he'd been, and he gave a vague answer about keeping busy. I didn't ask about the business, because we both knew what had happened to it. I didn't ask about the lover, because I already knew they'd split months ago, under circumstances that mirrored my own exit. He didn't ask about Daniel, because Daniel's presence was its own answer. The real moment came later, during the closing speech of the evening. The host was thanking major donors, recognizing their contributions. When my name was called not just as a donor, but as one of the event's newest board members, I stood, accepting the applause with a calm smile. I didn't look at him, but I didn't have to. The applause was a reminder to everyone in that room of where I stood now, and where he did not. By the time the night ended, I had achieved exactly what I'd come for. There had been no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic scenes, just presence, just proof. The kind of proof that doesn't need explanation, that speaks in the cut of your dress, the company you keep, the rooms you're still welcome in, and the rooms he no longer is. As Daniel and I left, I caught a final glimpse of him, alone by the bar, his drink untouched, staring into a space where his ambitions used to be. The whispers around him weren't curious anymore. They were pitying, and that, more than anything, was the final victory. Not the money, not the settlement, not even the public humiliation at the altar. It was this, that in the world where appearances are everything, he had become invisible, and I, the bride who walked away, had never been more seen.